Hey guys, welcome back, and if you're new, welcome to the channel. Today I'll be reconstructing a possible account of Sauron's deeds between the fall of Morgoth and the forging of the rings. Though frustratingly little is known about the beginning of the Second Age, it's undeniably a critical period in Sauron's history. The decisions he makes and events he sets in motion in this obscure era will have staggering impacts on Middle-earth in ages to come. So although any account of this time is going to contain a lot of inference and conjecture, it's still well worth the effort to grapple with our knowledge of Sauron's first years as an independent agent. In an earlier video, which you can find linked below, I pointed out that not much is stated about Sauron's original fall, and so much of what is stated is ambiguous, contradictory, or of dubious canonicity that it doesn't really clear things up much. However, throughout the First Age, Sauron's whereabouts and activities can be better understood. At the breaking of Utumno, he is known to be in Melkor's service, and he remains in Middle-earth during Melkor's captivity. The Silmarillion states that when the sun rises and men awaken in the east, Morgoth leaves command of the war to Sauron for a time, while he himself brings the second-born children of Eru under the shadow of his will. After the fourth battle of the War of the Jewels, Sauron drives the Noldor out of their fortress on Tol Sirion, and occupies it with his army of orcs, werewolves, and vampires. Shortly thereafter, he captures Beren, Finrod, and their 10 companions, which proves to be a major miscalculation, for Luthien and Huan arrive to free them, and after the pair defeats all Sauron's werewolves, they get him in such a literal stranglehold that he's forced to give up the passwords to the fortress, after which he takes flight in the form of a vampire, great as a dark cloud across the moon. And he fled, dripping blood from his throat upon the trees, and came to Taur Nufuin, and dwelt there, filling it with horror. It is unclear how long a particularly cranky Sauron would have to dwell in a place to properly fill it with horror, but based on the Lay of Leithian, he's apparently still there a year later, when Luthien appears before Morgoth in the guise of Thuringwithil, claiming to bring messages from Sauron's dark mansions in Taur Nufuin. To which Morgoth peevishly responds, "Tidings enough from Thu there came but short while since. What would he now?" A scant century later, the hosts of Valinor cross the sea and wage the war that ends in Morgoth's overthrow, and the near total destruction of Beleriand. This marks the next confirmed sighting of Sauron. When Thangorodrim was broken and Morgoth overthrown, Sauron put on his fair hue again and did obeisance to Eanwe, the herald of Manwe, and abjured all his evil deeds. And some hold that this was not at first falsely done, but that Sauron in truth repented, if only out of fear, being dismayed by the fall of Morgoth and the great wrath of the Lords of the West. Eanwe says he lacks the authority to pardon one of his own order, and tells Sauron to return to Aman for judgment. But Sauron is appalled by that prospect and goes into hiding instead, and he fell back into evil, for the bonds that Morgoth had laid upon him were very strong. In one sense, what happens next is literally history. The Tale of Years, in Appendix B to The Lord of the Rings, recounts that after about 500 years elapse, Sauron begins to stir again. He starts constructing Barad-dûr in the land of Mordor around the year 1000 of the Second Age. In 1200, in the guise of Annatar, he goes among the elven realms of Eriador, and wins the friendship of the Noldor of Eregion. In the 1500s, the elves working under his guidance create the Rings of Power, and in 1600, Sauron forges the one ruling ring in his volcanic forges at Mount Doom. While this gives him control over the other rings, it also reveals his name and designs to the elves, and from then on, war never ceased between the elves and Sauron. There would still be times when his whereabouts were unknown, his power slept, or his servants would carry out nefarious deeds in his stead. But from this point on, Mordor would remain the chief seat of Sauron's power. His identity and history would be recognized, and his goals and methods would remain more or less the same. But this account fails to give much information at all about Sauron's doings for over 1,000 years, which for context is much longer than the whole War of the Jewels recounted in the Quenta Silmarillion. It was during this period that Sauron's character was undergoing some of the most significant evolutions imaginable, from fearful repentance and regret to relapse. At the same time, his power and influence rose sharply, as he went from a fugitive stripped of all his previous might and authority, to a Dark Lord in his own right, with power over the wills of the Eldar literally wrapped around his finger, leading a massive army to conquer almost all of Middle-earth. Luckily for us, by cross-referencing a dozen documents spanning some 40 years of Tolkien's writing career, we can glean some sparse yet juicy details that help to fill in the picture a little bit more. Before we continue, I will take a moment to note my approach to the source material. The question of what counts as canon is far from settled in the Tolkien fandom, but as in my previous video on Sauron's origins, in cases of conflict I've given some precedence to The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and secondary consideration to the published Silmarillion. One factor working in my favor is that, while Sauron as a cohesive character can be dated back to 1937, the events of the Second Age were largely worked out during the later half of Tolkien's creative career, cutting down on the number of conflicting versions and the potential for contradiction. Though it does mean many of the sources I cite belong to more experimental phases of Middle-earth's history. Finally, from an in-universe perspective, records of the end of the First Age and beginning of the Second are fragmentary to non-existent, for a number of verisimilitudinous reasons. What records were made were often lost or destroyed in the chaos of those times, and the significance of many critical events was only recognized in hindsight, and would have gone unnoticed at the time they actually happened. Sauron's plea to Eowyn at the end of the War of Wrath is a critical event, not only in establishing a timeline, but because it's one of the few times that something of Sauron's true motives is revealed. While terror may be the underlying cause of his repentance, he is thought to be sincere in the conviction that his earlier choices were the wrong ones. This concept is echoed in several of Tolkien's letters. In one he writes, "At the beginning of the Second Age, he was not indeed wholly evil, not unless all reformers who want to hurry up with reconstruction and reorganization are wholly evil, even before pride and the lust to exert their will eat them up." However sincere his fearful repentance might have been, though, it's clear from Sauron's reaction that a free one-way ticket to Valinor was not the counter-offer he was looking for. Then Sauron was ashamed, and he was unwilling to return in humiliation and to receive from the Valar a sentence, it might be, of long servitude in proof of his good faith, for under Morgoth his power had been great. Sauron's first concern then was to hide, both from the army of the Valar, who now had reason to think his penitence wasn't as deeply felt as he'd made it out to be, and from the significant percentage of men, elves, and dwarves that would have some reason to hate him. Since he could still assume a pleasing form, this wouldn't have been too challenging as long as he minded his tongue and avoided making unguarded eye contact with the wrong person. He also likely needed to build up his strength again. Though his encounter with Huan and Luthien was well in the past, it seems to have been a significant blow, to his pride at least if not to his native power. Though it's often assumed Sauron played some part in the War of Wrath, there's no description of this, and actually I couldn't find any mention of him even leaving the Forest of Nightshade until after Thangorodrim is destroyed. The fact that Tair Nufuin did not sink entirely, but remained above the sea as an island, also seems circumstantially relevant, since it means that Sauron wouldn't have been forced to come out until he was good and ready. On top of healing from past hurts, with Morgoth's recent, extrusion from the Sphere of Arda, any power that he had loaned to Sauron directly is unlikely to remain available. The elements of Arda itself are still infused with a residue of Morgoth's will, which can be leveraged to manipulate the material world in various techno-magical ways. But even for Sauron, who understands the principles involved better than most, this could hardly be effortless. Plus, a lot of the land Morgoth was most heavily invested in has just been deliberately destroyed. Sauron is facing more mundane problems as well. No soldiers or spies to command, no privileges of rank to invoke, no fortresses to take refuge in, and projects centuries in the making, reduced to so many soggy heaps of ash. Apart from seeing to these personal vulnerabilities, he must also take stock of the world he now finds himself in. In other videos, I've observed that just because the records of the First Age don't have a lot to say about the lands beyond Beleriand, that doesn't mean nothing important was happening there. From the Blue Mountains east to the Sea of Rhûn, in Eriador and Rovanion and beyond, the land was widely, if sparsely, populated by all manners of peoples and clans. Remnants of the Nandor could be found along the shores of the Anduin, and depending on how you classify the elven kindreds, there were other Teleran clans scattered about as well, along with small bands or individuals living more solitary lives. Even further to the east, approaching the now-lost Lake of Cuiviénen, were the Avari, who, long before the Edain entered Beleriand, had formed relationships with men. The creator of the dwarves, the Vala Aule, had placed their forefathers at points scattered throughout Middle-earth to await the appointed time of their awakening. Of these spawn points, only the westward two were known. Somewhere in the Arid Luin, home to the Broadbeams and Firebeards, and Mount Gundabad at the northern end of the Misty Mountains, where Durin, the father of the Longbeards, awoke. In a late essay, Tolkien says the other two places were eastward, at distances as great or greater than that between the Blue Mountains and Gundabad. Though these 4 points were far sundered, the dwarves of different kindreds were in communication, and in the early ages often held assemblies of delegates at Mount Gundabad. He also notes that despite their preference for putting down roots, the dwarves could be great travelers at need, and by the Second Age they had developed an extensive road system. Something else already well established was the enmity between dwarves and orcs. Well before the War of the Jewels, when Morgoth occupied his first dwelling in Autumno, orcs and other sinister beings routinely issued forth to prey on whatever and whoever they could find. An essay from 1970 says that in the Second Age, these remaining primordial orcs of the East were larger, fiercer, and more independent than the standardized soldiers of Angband and their surviving descendants. Morgoth is also known to have sent particularly terrifying monsters to harass the newly awakened elves around Cuiviénen, capturing some of them and filling the rest with mistrust and fear to keep them from coming into contact with the other Valar. He carried out a similar operation on the First Men, whose awakening place of Hildorian was in Middle-earth's easternmost regions, the closest point to the rising sun. Indeed, it was their flight from the persecution of Morgoth's servants and followers that initially brought the three peoples of the Edain all the way to Beleriand. Just as had happened on the Great Journey of the Eldar, various groups of westbound men turned aside, became separated, or settled down along the way. At least one faction of those who had arrived in Beleriand turned around and went back. These laggard kindred of the Etani, after the drowning of Beleriand, were either in Eriador, some settled, some still wandering, or else had never passed the Misty Mountains, and were scattered in the lands between the Iron Hills and the Sea of Rhûn eastward, and the Great Forest, in the borders of which, northward and eastward, many were already settled. According to Tolkien, both the Druidine and the ancestors of the Hobbits were part of these migrations. The end of the First Age saw the arrival of waves of refugees from the west. First would have been the defeated remnants of Morgoth's armies, as the hosts of the Valar put them to rout over the course of 4 decades. This seems to have mainly consisted of orcs, but also included some dragons, at least one Balrog, and Shelob. How Shelob came there, flying from ruin, no tale tells, for out of the dark years few tales have come. But still, she was there. Who was there before Sauron, and before the first stone of Barad-dûr, and she served none but herself, drinking the blood of elves and men. The influx of orcs caused problems for the dwarves, who found themselves fighting to maintain control of the iron-rich arid Engren. When Morgoth fell and Angband was destroyed, hosts of the orcs fled eastward seeking homes. They were now masterless and without any general leadership, but they were well-armed and very numerous, cruel, savage, and reckless in assault. In the battles that followed, the dwarves were glad to make alliance with men. The men of the region, in many cases akin to their Beleriandic counterparts but less well-organized or equipped, were also not having a great time. The Akalabeth tells that after the war, the surviving men in Morgoth's service fled back into the east, where many of their race were still wandering in the unharvested lands, wild and lawless, refusing alike the summons of the Valar and of Morgoth. And the evil men came among them, and cast over them a shadow of fear, and they took them for kings. And men dwelt in darkness, and were troubled by many evil things that Morgoth had devised in the days of his dominion. The Numenorian emphasis on the savagery and wickedness of the men of the East is easily conflated with the threats posed by Sauron's Third Age allies, from places like Hrun and Khand, but it's likely that such remote regions were not the only, or even the main, subject of this passage. When the narrative says that Morgoth's servants fled east, this is a less helpful detail than it might seem, because all of Middle-earth is east and south of the now ruined region of Beleriand. Everyone who isn't taking a ship west to their Valar-designated living paradise is, by definition, fleeing east, if they want to avoid drowning. We know many dragons settled in the withered heath north of Dale, and escaping Balrog only made it as far as Khazad-dûm, and many of the surviving orcs largely retreated to the Misty Mountains. No doubt some made it even further, but when the men of Numenor speak of trouble in the east, we should recognize that they likely included Eriador and Rovanion along with Khand and Rhûn. Along with the fleeing armies of Morgoth, other inhabitants of Beleriand were also forced to evacuate. The Edain of Beleriand had been all but wiped out in the war, and most of those who survived sailed west to Numenor. But there were a few who stayed behind, seeking a fresh start in the wildlands among their sundered kin. The dwarves of the Blue Mountains had likewise suffered losses, some of them in battles against the Sindar of Doriath, and while the Blue Mountains themselves did more or less survive, the ancient mansions of Belegost and Nogrod were destroyed in the general ruination. So, after a few decades, the remaining dwarves of Beleriand also moved east, many to join their relatives in Khazad-dûm, increasing its wealth and power. Those of the Eldar who either didn't wish to sail west or weren't allowed to ended up clumped together in Lindon, together with the remaining green elves of Osiriand and the Falathrim. A contingent of Doriathran hardliners, appalled at the prospect of living under the rule of a Noldoran king, however technically, would eventually travel east to found realms among their Sylvan cousins. The realm of Greenwood is noted as being one of the northern of these. While the exact details of its founding vary, it was also around this time that a group of elves founded a haven in the south in what would later be known as Dol Amroth. So we can tell that the beginning of the Second Age was a time of great displacement and upheaval. Existing populations were forced to adapt to new arrivals, some friendly, some indifferent, and some hostile. New alliances formed even as old grudges festered. To make matters worse, compared to the mighty civilizations that had risen in Beleriand during the Elder Days, most of the rest of Middle-earth was, well, a technological backwater. Men mainly lived in small, scattered settlements barely out of the Bronze Age, dependent on the dwarves for both metallurgy and infrastructure. The elves to the east of the Arid Luin hadn't been blessed with the intensive cultivation of a Maiaran queen as the Sindar had, much less the benefit of dwelling beside the Valar themselves in the stainless land of Aman. While their woodcraft was unparalleled, they mostly remained a wandering, hidden folk, and some of the Avari could be downright nasty in their scorn for the so-called High Elves. The Avari in general remained secretive, hostile to the Eldar, and untrustworthy. In other words, the whole geopolitical scenario could be summed up as disharmony and wasteful friction, and like a beaver tormented by the sound of rushing water, our favorite renegade Maya couldn't help but react to it. Despite having rejected Eowyn's judgment, we know Sauron still had some good motives. The ever-helpful collection of essays called Myths Transformed tells us that Sauron never reached the heights of nihilistic madness that Morgoth did, that even in future ages, he would retain vestiges of positive purpose, and that his vision was always to improve the physical prosperity and orderliness of his subjects. But the effects of a long age spent in Morgoth's service can't be so lightly set aside. The status he once held has greatly swelled his pride, and this is a main factor in why he can't bring himself to accept the Valar's judgment. Another effect seems to have been disillusionment. We know Sauron once sincerely adored Melkor, but even at the point of his first capture, Melkor's dissipation of his own power had left him greatly reduced as a person, and by the War of Wrath, any lofty pretenses Melkor once possessed had dissolved, leaving him a cowering, spiteful wretch. Witnessing this decline might have contributed to Sauron's jaded attitude toward the other Valar. He probably deluded himself with the notion that the Valar, including Melkor, having failed, Eru had simply abandoned Ea, or at any rate Arda, and would not concern himself with it anymore. If he thought about the Astari, he imagined them as emissaries from the Valar, seeking to establish their lost power again and colonize Middle-earth as a mere effort of defeated imperialists. His cynicism, sincerely, regarded the motives of Manwë as precisely the same as his own. Though his overall goals are, broadly speaking, beneficent, Sauron sees no reason, either ethical or practical, to abide by the Valar's plans rather than implementing his own. And so, by around the year 500, he is determined to go it alone, and started enacting his plan to bring the abandoned peoples and lands of Middle-earth into an era of harmony and prosperity, kicking and screaming if necessary. Unlike Morgoth, or Melian for that matter, Sauron doesn't want to be tied down by sinking his power into the world itself. Instead, his goal is to control the minds and hearts of Middle-earth's people. Dwarves being notoriously resistant to this kind of influence, they do not initially draw his interest. Men are much more responsive to his methods, but their usefulness is limited by their short lifespans, lack of spiritual acumen, and current, lamentably rustic state. Orcs are a similar case, more easily brought under his control, but even more disorganized and less clever than men. The shadow of Morgoth's will over both peoples also means they're more than usually prone to squabbling amongst themselves. It's maybe for these reasons that multiple sources identify elves as Sauron's main target during the early Second Age. Though as raw material, even they leave much to be desired. For one thing, the elves don't like Sauron very much, and would likely balk at some of his more radical philosophies and methods. Just like everyone else, the elves who remain in Middle-earth are in a far less exalted state than they enjoyed during the First Age, with many of their most brilliant and ambitious leaders dead. And in some ways, the elves are as contentious and divided as their fellow races, with long memories to accompany their long lives, and fully prepared to engage in schisms over things like the pronunciation of certain letters. Therefore, the first step in Sauron's plan to improve elvendom is to increase the usefulness of men and orcs, and rebuild his influence over them. Thus, slowly he reverted again to the allegiance of Morgoth, and began to seek power by force, marshalling again and directing the orcs and other evil things of the First Age. We can make some solid guesses about how he went about doing this, which was essentially by taking a leaf right out of Morgoth's book. The Tale of Adonel, appended to the Athrobeth Finrada Andreth, describes how a corrupting entity supposed to be Melkor went about enthralling the first men. Though the beautiful being who comes to them promises to instruct men in everything they could wish, he was less swift than we had hoped to teach us how to find or to make for ourselves the things that we desired. And we depended upon his gifts, fearing to return to a life without them that now seemed poor and hard. All that he taught seemed good, for he had great knowledge. Anything that we thought would please him, however evil, we did, in the hope that he would lighten our afflictions. For most of us this was in vain, but to some he began to show favor, to the strongest and the cruelest. He gave gifts to them, and knowledge that they kept secret, and they became powerful and proud, and they enslaved us so that we had no rest from labor amidst our afflictions. Another note to the Athrobeth observes the operations of Sauron naturally and inevitably resembled or repeated those of his master. So we can take the Tale of Adonel as a plausible description of how Sauron may have approached the men of the Second Age. He's also known to have taken a comparable approach to rehabilitating the northern orcs. In the Second Age, Sauron, when he turned back to evil, had gathered to his service all the orcs that were scattered far and wide in the northern world, cowed and masterless, furtive lurkers in dark places. He rekindled the lusts of their black hearts, and to some he showed favor, and fed them lavishly, breeding and training them into tribes of strong and cruel warriors. The results of these efforts were initially subtle, and seem to have developed gradually. It takes even the most perceptive characters a couple of centuries to notice something has definitely changed. One source from the famously unreliable history of Galadriel and Celeborn indicates that by the year 700, Galadriel perceived that there was an evil controlling purpose abroad in the world, and that it seemed to proceed from a source further to the east, beyond Eriador and the Misty Mountains. Starting around 750, on his many voyages around the coasts of Middle-earth, Aldarion, then heir to the throne of Numenor, was often obliged to rebuild his haven of Vignalonde, sometimes due to storm damage, but other times due to hostile attacks. By 869, men near the coasts were growing afraid of the Numenorians, or were becoming openly hostile. And Aldarion heard rumors of some lord in Middle-earth who hated the men of the ships. By 882, Gil-galad is sufficiently concerned that he's openly asking Numenor for military support. He asserts in his letter to Tar Mineldur, "It is no tyranny of evil men, as your son believes, but a servant of Morgoth is stirring, and evil things wake again. Each year it gains in strength, for most men are ripe to its purpose. Already enmity creeps along the coast toward Hithaglir." There's no record of Sauron directly meddling with the elves during this period, but again, we must assume he is disguising himself. And at this point, Sauron had as yet no single name, and his operations had not been perceived to proceed from a single evil spirit, prime servant of Melkor. So, none of the elves would have had reason to take note of the mysterious stranger offering what seemed like really good advice, or just who it was who happened to make the right inflammatory comment at the right critical moment to permanently alter someone's mood or outlook. Accounts vary on the individuals involved and their motives and aims, but it is around 750 that many of the Eldar of Lindon strike out on their own. The Noldor found Eregion, Orifair travels to the Greenwood, and Galadriel and Celeborn start putting down roots in Lorien. This could just be coincidence, but it's easy to see these events as indicating a spirit of restlessness, separatism, and overconfidence in the elves, which sounds a lot like the societal trends that Melkor used to manipulate the Noldor of Tirion to devastating effect. But before Sauron's crockpot of low and slow moral decadence can really start cooking, an unforeseen development threatens to stop him. In the year 600, the first returning ships from Numenor land on the shores of Middle-earth, and the sailors are met with joy from both the elves and their own long-sundered mortal kin. Over the next couple of centuries, largely spearheaded by the great navigator and terrible son, husband, and father Aldarion, Numenorian activity on Middle-earth's coasts only increases. Appendix A tells us that at first the Numenorians had come to Middle-earth as teachers and friends of lesser men afflicted by Sauron, and as time passes, the island nation's ties to the elves of Lindon only grow stronger. Even before he acquires some highly personal reasons to hate and fear Numenor, Sauron was less than thrilled by this. Numenor is populated by the descendants of the Edain, who represent the elements in men most opposed to Morgoth and most resistant to his influence. Their island is visited by messengers from Valinor itself, meaning Numenor provides the strongest link between the Valar and the inhabitants of Middle-earth, both mortal and elven. Their association with other Mannish tribes weakens Sauron's hold over them by providing a competing source of knowledge and power. And finally, as even the Numenorians can foresee at this point, their presence in Middle-earth could easily become exploitative or even rapacious. And eventually they do indeed show a tendency to mismanage Middle-earth's resources and provoke conflict with its peoples, the very definition of wasteful friction. So increasingly, Sauron's secondary goal is to counteract Numenor's influence and hinder their efforts to get more permanent toeholds on Middle-earth. Between the rise of the semi-sovereign technocratic paradise of Eregion, the unnerving possibility of military alliance between Numenor and Lindon, and the endemic infighting between the elves generally, Sauron also needs to refine his initial strategy for enlightening the elves. Perhaps those he can't persuade or convince, he may need to control through some of his more enhanced techniques: surveillance, manipulation, and intimidation. Ideally, he would pursue such policies from a defensible realm of his own, somewhere he can retreat to and fortify if necessary, and preferably a place where he can undertake his more flamboyant experiments in post-Morgoth metaphysics in peace. Luckily for him, he knows just the place, and around the year 1000, with Tar Aldarion continuing to forsake his domestic duties in favor of ever more expeditions, Sauron therefore left Eriador alone for a while, and he chose the land of Mordor, as it was afterwards called, for a stronghold as a counter to the threat of the Numenorian landings. For Sauron, the area has much to recommend it. Ringed by mountains, it's just begging for the chance to withstand a siege from the north or west. One of the few gaps in its defenses is occupied by Shelob, which Sauron seems to get a kick out of. As for Sauron, he knew where she lurked. It pleased him that she should dwell there, hungry but unabated in malice, a more sure watch upon that ancient path into his land than any other that his skill could have devised. Plus, Mordor is home to the ash-belching volcano Orodruin, in which Sauron builds his personal forge. Late notes tell us that the volcano, and the mountain range it's part of, were raised by none other than Melkor himself in his early wars with the Valar. So not only will Sauron find the land itself more apt to his Morgoth-derived sorceries, he'll also enjoy the nostalgic hominess of a land steeped in corruption. The obvious problem with this is that Sauron is still supposed to be leaning into his benevolent teacher role, successfully maintaining enough plausible deniability that the elves of Eregion will enthusiastically embrace the arrival of an undocumented Maya. Building a watchtower in a place literally named Land of Darkness is pretty blatant Dark Lord behavior, and you would expect the already nervous elves would show a stronger adverse reaction. You'll be happy to know that your concerns were shared by Sauron himself. In an essay dating to 1970, Tolkien notes, his occupation of Mordor he no doubt would have kept secret if he could. But the Numenorians occupying the mouths of Anduin and the shorelands of Lebanon had discovered his devices and revealed them to Gil-galad. But at the turn of the millennium, Sauron's actions in Mordor still aren't overtly sinister. Between the giant spider in the mountain passes, the intermittent eruptions, and the indifferent arability, no one is really that interested in laying claim to Mordor. One note suggests that the area may have earned its name well before Sauron's arrival due to the clouds of volcanic ash that often blanketed the area. So Sauron isn't stepping on anyone's toes by settling down there, and he goes out of his way to secure the goodwill and allegiance of the men living on his borders. From the outside, all he's really doing is beginning some kind of work on a tower that won't be finished for another 600 years. The toxic slag heaps of later ages are nowhere to be seen. The marshes may be unpleasant, but they're not haunted yet. There is no Minas Morgul, no circling hellhawks, and most importantly, no real army. According to the same 1970 essay, until 1600 he was still using the disguise of a beneficent friend, and often journeyed at will in Eriador with few attendants, and so could not risk any rumor that he was gathering armies. Even after he forges the ring and the elves reject him, it takes him over 90 years to build up the force that he leads into Eriador. Tolkien basically concludes that Sauron was so apparently unprepared for war that even after his identity and his scheming with the rings was revealed to the elves, they still couldn't be sure that an armed invasion was even part of his plan. While in later years Sauron will draw soldiers from his distant eastern and southern holdings, it's only after his first defeat that he would focus his attention in earnest on the men of Húin and Harad. At this point, he's still managing foreign affairs through his emissaries, and perforce neglected the east, nor had he yet given sufficient thought to the lands in the south. He doesn't dare build up any significant force of orcs, and at this point, some of the orcs still won't even give him the time of day. The eastern orcs, who had not experienced the power and terror of the Eldar or the valor of the Edain, were not subservient to Sauron. While he was obliged for the cozening of western men and elves to wear as fair a form and countenance as he could, they despised him and laughed at him. So when Sauron finally approaches the elves as Annatar, sometime around 1200, even if the elves were to recognize this newcomer as the same person who's recently been active in the south, which is something I couldn't find confirmation of either way, they don't necessarily have any evidence that he's anything other than what he claims to be. Of course, that doesn't mean they all welcome him. While Celebrimbor is eager to benefit from the useful knowledge we're told Annatar genuinely shared, Gil-galad and Elrond won't even let him in Lindon, and Galadriel openly questions his story of being a Maya in Aule's service. This raises a final question. If all Annatar's charm and preparation were insufficient to even gain him entrance to Lindon, if Galadriel can tell right away that his vibes are wrong, then why don't the elves of Eregion also notice this, especially with the warnings of their kin? In his synopsis of Concerning Galadriel and Celeborn, Christopher Tolkien comments, "No explanation is offered in this rapid outline of why Galadriel scorned Sauron, unless she saw through his disguise, or of why, if she did perceive his true nature, she permitted him to remain in Eregion." But in this he may be overestimating the need for such an explanation. You don't have to know that someone is actually Sauron to mistrust them, or want to keep their radical philosophies from spreading through your realm. Galadriel may perceive a darkness in Annatar, but she also perceived one in her uncle Feanor, who, whatever his failings, was emphatically not a servant of Morgoth. We're told that she also failed to see that same shadow growing in herself. And Annatar is quick to suggest another, decidedly unflattering motive behind the mistrust he's been met with. "A mighty king is Gil-galad, and wise in all lore is Master Elrond, and yet they will not aid me in my labors. Can it be that they do not desire to see other lands become as blissful as their own? But wherefore should Middle-earth remain forever desolate and dark, whereas the elves could make it as fair as Eressëa, nay, even as Valinor? And since you have not returned thither, as you might, I perceive that you love this Middle-earth, as do I. Is it not then our task to labor together for its enrichment, and for the raising of all the elven kindreds that wander here untaught, to the height of that power and knowledge which those have who are beyond the sea?" The midpoint of the Second Age in one sense sees Sauron triumphant. He's managed to find a permanent home, independently regain power over orcs and men, and even deceive and beguile the High Elves. In another sense, though, this is the end of his story. Never again does he entertain making a change to his methods, or adopting a new perspective. Fixed in a role that inexorably limits his options and narrows his horizons, he becomes ever more like the master whose service he forswore, and walked behind him on the same ruinous path, down into the void. If you enjoyed this account of Sauron's zany adventures frolicking through a continent in crisis, hit the like button with the wrath of the Lords of the West, and consider joining the host of subscribers. For more secret missives and dark rumors from afar, you can check out my Patreon page at the link below. Thank you to everyone for watching, and special thanks to my patrons, including Seven-Eyed, Rico Mariani, Perhyle the Gardener, Amar, Catherine Berry, Dr. Newton Wen, Steve B., John H. Austin Jr., James A. McCormick, Kevin Gilstad, Nick Rialo, Jeremy Buckingham, Dorwin Gray, Zach Burns, Brendan Mooney, E. Rose B., Allison Kreutzberg, Luke, Joel Bion, and Jarrod Carver. Until next time, may you be lavishly fed and grow strong and cruel.